Hi everyone, my name is Winifred Lewis. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Queensland. And you, Katie?
Yes, I'm Katie Greenaway. I'm an associate professor at the University of Melbourne, studying social psychology.
And we're here to talk about a project that we were involved in. We were just tracking it back through time. And the project finished in 2013 and started earlier than 2009. We're not exactly sure when. And it was a reference list, an annotated reference list on the psychological research and teaching involving Indigenous Australians. And so version 8, which was published in 2013, was the last iteration. And I know the reason why we stopped doing it, and it was because there was a wonderful resource that came out that was published by the Australian Indigenous Psychologists Association, which was a free textbook called Working Together, which is still available online and which we will hopefully link to in the comments box when we publish this. But I guess we started in the first decade of the 21st century at some point, Katie.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't a great availability of resources. And so I remember when I started this idea, which we also collaborated with another professor called Blake McKinney to do, we wanted to provide profs that were updating their curriculum with a list of every publication that had ever come out with Indigenous Australians and our comments about what was in it and how it could be used. And so a lot of people at the time were starting to try and, what's now called indigenize the curriculum to bring content relevance to their courses. Do you recall, Katie, how you came to be involved?
Yeah, I think it was because I did my honors thesis with you on a topic that was very related to this issue around prejudice and discrimination, and in particular, methods of improving attitudes towards Indigenous Australians on behalf of non-Indigenous Australians. And we also looked at the reverse experience, and that really, I think, highlighted for me how much relevance there is in the Australian context for the kinds of things that we study in social psychology, but really how little researchers often aim to look at these kinds of relationships in our own backyard, where I think they're most important to look into. So there's the sort of research and scholarly side of that, but then certainly at the time, and hopefully I think things are changing now, that was really ill represented in the teaching curriculum. And so the goal here for me, I think, was to bring my research into documents that are relevant for teaching and vice versa, because they inform one another.
Yeah, that's right. And I think when we published, because I think, were you a co-author on the publication of Emmy Quinn's data?
Yes.
Yeah. So that was, I think, along with another paper in the same year by Meller, a researcher, that was among the first publications ever to represent Indigenous Australian perspectives in social psychological work. So Emmy Quinn had done her honors thesis with me, and it looked at an ironic backlash effect where when you make salient a human identity, Indigenous Australians became more likely to forgive white Australians. And then Katie's thesis the next year, unfortunately, showed that when you make salient a human identity, white Australians forgive themselves and fail to respond with support for reconciliation. So it was a really interesting line of work, and I think ended up being 4 or 5 papers long. But what we wanted to do in this resource, which was on an annotated bibliography, I think we called it, was just literally find every reference and make them available, grouped by disciplinary subheadings. And in the last iteration, there was actually a scholarship of teaching and learning on Indigenous psychology, and that was so exciting to see that come through over that kind of decade of work. But in addition, this resource had come out that was led by the Australian Indigenous Psychologists Association, so we kind of felt we wouldn't need to do any more. I guess while we were doing it, there was a lot of positive feedback from profs around the country that reached out to you and me and Blake and said, thank you. And some people would sometimes send us the reference if they had published something and ask us to integrate it into the next year, which we did. And I know in my own work, I found a lot of papers that I otherwise wouldn't have seen through the project. And there's a sense that it made our, it kind of legitimized our work at UQ, legitimized the work of other scholars at other unis. Like some people wrote to us and said, look, I've shown your reference list to, a committee, and I'm trying to get them to take up the agenda. But I guess I'd say, once we stopped doing it, I'm not sure that the agenda actually did manifest as a commitment and as an implementation. And like you said, Katie, I feel like we're reinventing the wheel now. Here at UQ, we're just starting another project on indigenized the curriculum. It's not a fait accompli. It hasn't achieved. I mean, what's your sense of how things are where you are at Melbourne?
Yeah, it's the same situation at the moment. We're really only just paying lip service to the idea that it's important to embed Indigenous perspectives into like all curricula. And in my experience at the moment, that hasn't been backed up with concrete action, and certainly not policy-based changes to incorporate those kinds of perspectives. I'd love it if it were, but it's something that I had in mind when I redeveloped the social psychology section of the first year course here to try and incorporate some of those perspectives. And I actually returned to this project that we did to remind myself of what some of those might be. But it's an ongoing process that I think I'm not even sure if it's getting off the ground at the moment, to be honest.
It'll be interesting to see what happens. So for us at UQ, I think part of the motivation to restart was there's some changes at the professional accreditation level where this APAC, Australian Psychological Accreditation Council, has introduced a new KPI, or not, that's not what it's called. What is it called? Anyways, a curriculum aim or attribute, an attribute that undergrads are meant to acquire of cultural safety and responsiveness and competence. The lingo changes. And that's really associated with a new push called IEPEP 2, which I think it stands for Australian Indigenous Psychology Education something. So it's led by Pat Dudgeon and has a team that they're trying to encourage people to engage, and also using the new language of decolonizing the curriculum. And I guess I hope that it gets through to the group of 8 and it gets through to all psychologists and it gets through to other courses in the universities. And it's an empirical question, right?
Well, this is kind of what I mean about the policy side of things, right? Like you have to make there be consequences if these kinds of changes aren't enacted, and that's how you change behavior. So I'm really excited to see that change, and I hope it does translate into some adjustments, at UQ and beyond.
I was thinking about it as a project and whether there's any lessons that others, people could learn. I mean, I guess one of the themes that I've seen from some of those resources early on, more than 15 years ago now, however long that is that there actually was a need. So, you say that people are motivated by coercion, but in the diffusion of innovation literature, we know that kind of just making it possible, the first 5% move, making it fun and easy, the next 20% move, making it normative, the middle group will move, and then coercion is required for another 20%, and the last 5%, you just have to wait for them to die off. That's my summary of an immense literature. When we created those resources, people did move. Like the keeners around the country were like, yes, I've wanted to do this. But yeah, then that's kind of like, I think, well, our group kind of did a handover, and we also, you know, Katie finished her PhD and quickly became an international superstar. And you just sort of think to yourself, now we're almost turning the wheel again a decade later. What are your opinion on?
Yeah, that actually is the lesson for me, sort of, is that this kind of experience is one that has to be lived and has to be ongoing and just incorporated into a researcher or a teacher or an administrator's sense of self and understanding of how the world operates and how they need to go about operating in it. So for me, you know, returning to these documents, I was reminded all over again, yeah, we did start this project, but I didn't take it forward, you know, necessarily in my research or in all of my teaching. And so it's something that I really do try to be mindful of now, but I think it needs to be incorporated as a teaching philosophy, as a research philosophy, as a lab, you know, coordination philosophy. So that's my takeaway and my hope for myself as well.
Yeah. And here we're trying to create like curriculum review meetings by subdiscipline. So something we can revisit as a group for the social psych profs or the methods profs or the neuro profs, and just think, okay, how is this relevant to our practice as teachers, and how's this going to move forward? And hopefully that will create the lasting normative change that will enable, you know, people coming into the teaching profession in psychology to embrace the agenda and feel empowered and equipped to integrate some of this content into their courses.